sure your cell phone is switched off or on silence. Just be attentive and engaging. We will allow questions at the end. But for now, I'd like to welcome Professor Mabuto Sibanda, Head of School at SAFE, to do a short welcome and introduce our guest speaker, who is all the way from India to give us this lecture. Thank you.
Distinguished guests attending this lecture online and those here present, members of the University of KwaZulu-Natal community, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is truly an honor and privilege to welcome each and every one of you today as we gather to delve into a topic of utmost importance: vaccine nationalism, insights from India. In a world that is constantly evolving, the intersection between science, technology, and healthcare is a key driver of progress. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate to have with us an esteemed expert in the field, someone whose work has not only contributed significantly to the advancements in vaccine research, but also someone who has played a pivotal role in shaping the discourse around innovation in healthcare. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest lecturer, Professor Chirantan Chatterjee from the University of Sussex in England, and in particular from the Science Policy Research Unit in the Business School at the University of Sussex. From September 1, 2023, Professor Chatterjee has been a professoriate at the University of Sussex as a professor of economics, of innovation, and global health. He is also the PhD program convener at the SPRU, and in 2009, he was Ref Deputy Lead at the University of Sussex Business School. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, UK, as a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. Generally, Professor Chatterjee is known as an applied economist with interest in the economics of technological change, pharmaceutical economics, and global health. He is currently a visiting fellow with Hoover Institute, Stanford University. In the past decade, that's from 2011 to 2021, Prof. Chatterjee was a full-time faculty member in India, working as an associate and assistant professor in economics, public policy and strategy at the top 3 FT 100 ranked Indian business schools: IIM Bangalore, Indian School of Business, and IIMA. Professor Chatterjee is well published in top peer-reviewed journals like Management Science, the Rand Journal of Economics, Research Policy, Production, and Operations Management, Journal of Development Economics, among other esteemed journals. Most recently, in 2020 and 2021, Prof. Chatterjee worked with the United Nations in evaluating their multi-partner trust fund response to the COVID-19 and its impact on the Sustainable Development Goals across global vulnerable economies in Africa, Southern Asia, and Latin America. Also, in 2021 to 2022, Prof. Chatterjee was invited to join an interdisciplinary team to assess non-price innovation policy instruments for biopharmaceutical research and development, working with the World Health Organization and Oslo Medicines Initiative. We are privileged to have Professor Chatterjee share his insights, experiences, and the latest developments in the realm of vaccine nationalism. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Chatterjee. We look forward to a thought-provoking and enlightening session. Professor Chatterjee.
All right. Thank you, Dean Subanda, for the very kind words, and I appreciate your time for this lecture. I know the university is coming back after the winter break, and sorry to intrude into your extended holidays as university opens up, both in Sussex as well as I'm supposing here as well. Most of the things are covered here. I just want to give a brief disclosure, which is that I will talk about insights from India, but not in a very strict sense. I have a paper on how not vaccine nationalism, but actually vaccine sub-nationalism played out in India. So we'll get an opportunity to discuss the evidence from that particular paper. But there's a broader conversation I wanted to have with everyone here in the university on this point that is not going to go away from us. And I assert at the end of my talk that having seen what we have seen in the last 3 to 4 years on health, vaccines, and medical innovation, and the nationalism and the complex politics around it, are we at all prepared enough to deal with it when it comes to and hits us again when another pandemic strikes? And that's the conversation where I think my research is trying to contribute to with an interdisciplinary lens, coming from Sussex, our long relationship with South Africa, the department where I'm situated in, Science Policy Research Unit, which is one of the world's most well-known innovation studies center, and it's located within the business school, which is one of UK's top business schools in the country. So there's this interesting mix I wanted to leave you with as you ponder on vaccine nationalism, so that we can do 2024 and subsequent years better going forward in our global health policy decisions. So what is vaccine nationalism? All right. Just in preparation for this talk, I posted a LinkedIn poll saying, what is vaccine nationalism? And I have, over the years, like connections in the industry, in the policymaking space, in the not-for-profit space, and internationally, from the US, given my PhD and my affiliation at Stanford and at Carnegie Mellon, back in India, in East Asia, etc. And what I'm noticing in that quick poll is that people know about it lazily, but don't really understand the underlying reasons why it arose and how you can mitigate it. So I'm going to try to argue that here are the reasons probably it's what it arose, what can we learn from it, club it with evidence I have from India to leave you with some thoughts on how you can do global health and innovation policy normatively in a more equitable way, all right? I was looking up the trends of the words vaccine nationalism. And on Google Trends, if you do a worldwide search, you will see there is a sudden peak of the phrase vaccine nationalism during the COVID era on the right side of the picture. But it's not like it's new to humanity. It happened, I will argue soon, even during the 2009-10 SARS vaccine crisis. And certain governments hoarded vaccines, leaving others vulnerable. And yet we seem to have not learned much about it. Though, that being said, there were mechanisms like COVAX and other multinational, multi-country arrangements that the WHO and others tried to bring into place with the COVID era to see if it can be mitigated to some extent. I had a video here. The video seems to be not working, but basically this video, if you just Google vaccine nationalism BBC News, it should come on YouTube on the top. Essentially, it's saying the timeline of how it started with President Trump in that time talking about how he wants to hoard vaccines and that narrative spreading around the world. And then there were some mitigation mechanisms by different organizations, including the WHO, to see that hoarding doesn't happen and the most vulnerable also get access to vaccines. Mr. Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, talked about why it's a one world, one health issue, and how you can't keep certain population brackets and cohorts vulnerable, because from a selfish perspective too, not just from a social perspective, that's going to cost a lot, both in terms of economic terms and also in terms of ethical terms. So I'm going to skip this, but essentially the idea is something that the world has seen for a long time now. So there are scriptures which talks about anti-hoarding laws in civilizations. This is a graph of what happened in the middle 1800s in England, where they were trying to balance the weight of cotton with the weight of gold, and some greedy profiteers in the system were essentially hoarding gold and showing that, well, gold is in an unbalanced situation and we are going to hoard it, But the basic point of this message is that the word hoarding is something we need to take away from. The economics of hoarding is what drives vaccine nationalism, essentially, is what I'm trying to argue with this slide. And as I said, it's not new in the vaccines world. So in 2009, the feared limited production of the H1N1 vaccine affected the availability of the doses of vaccines in developing countries. The Australian government ensured that their local manufacturer, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, would meet the government's domestic demands prior to shipping the vaccines to the United Nations. And this pattern has been also observed for other vaccines, not just pandemic-related vaccines like in polio and smallpox. In fact, this pattern probably is observed in many other healthcare products, where increasingly countries with the ideas around health security, global supply chains, protectionism are showing traits of trying to hoard products for national health security purposes, and then in the end losing out because they are not understanding the One Health implications of it. Okay. It's done very shamefully, it's glaring, and yet people do it. So if you do a quick Google, there's a very famous RAND study around when the pandemic was raging around the world, which shows that if you do vaccine nationalism, even if it is like selfish global north countries, they will lose to the extent of $119 billion a year. Basically, if they are continuing to take their mRNA vaccines or AstraZeneca vaccines, and they're not letting the poor, the global south, get vaccinated, this may mean that they remain exposed in a probabilistic sense to the spread of the mutants of the virus over time, which will damage the economic productivity of those developed world nations. Ultimately, some RAND scientists estimated this would be something like $119 billion a year. Now, just to give you some perspective how big or small this number is, to get a new pharmaceutical product in the US out today, some estimates are suggesting it's upwards of $2 billion. So basically, if you don't engage in vaccine nationalism, you are saving the world for 60 such new molecules and products. Because it's 60 times 2, that's the cost of vaccine nationalism. Another non-health example, so the UK economy today from higher education is getting something like $70 billion a year from foreign students coming in. So it's like close to 2 times of that number in terms of the substantiveness and the economic implications of engaging in vaccine nationalism. And yet, countries do it nonetheless. Countries do it, as my colleague, Professor Madhupa in McGill University in Canada was tweeting in the middle of 2021 that, look, the global north seems to be getting some vaccines, but look at the global south. They are the non-Greens folks in, they just don't have access to any vaccines, right? So that's the, as an economist and as a social scientist, I feel like it's not just a problem of health economics or innovation economics, but it's also a problem of the philosophy around which we behave and the decisions we take and how we justify it ex post and the behavioral implications of it. So the behavioral implications of this are very interesting, and I'll give you a short snippet here. I can't cover all the underlying irrational and rational behavior human beings and policymakers are exhibiting in taking a decision that is economically costly and ethically costly as well. But nonetheless, I'll just give you like a quick primer of potentially the three drivers, the behavioral economics drivers of why vaccine nationalism happens. So there are three theories floating around in behavioral economics. One is the story of endowment effect. Okay, so it's the idea that people tend to place a higher value on objects they own or merely possess than the objects they do not own. So suppose you own a car, you suddenly start valuing that car much more than the world when you didn't have that car. Okay? Suppose you get vaccinated, you start possessing valuing vaccines and getting vaccinated much more than the world where you didn't get vaccines because of whatever reason that may be. So the endowment effect results in the idea of nations and households and policymakers not being able to let go of the fact that sometimes a couple of doses are okay as long as other parts of the world are also getting one dose of vaccine, right? So the idea of difficulty in discarding starts manifesting because of this endowment effect, okay? The second channel through which behavioral economics can explain this is the idea of a commodity theory. The commodity theory is explaining that this is a psychological effect of scarcity. Any commodity will be valued to the extent that it is unavailable, okay? Suddenly, if there is a shortage of, I don't know, rice grains, which should be a broader mass available product, people will start valuing rice grains. Suddenly, if there is a shortage of vaccines and there are pressures from the outside world, the global north will start valuing vaccines a little bit more than the world where there was no such shortage in it. Which tells you the commodity theory actually is linked to the supply side incentives for innovation. So long as regions like South Africa, India, Brazil, the global south can create their own national health, vaccines, pharma, med devices, innovation ecosystems, there will not be any scarcity felt. And potentially then we can ameliorate our vulnerabilities and dependencies with global north through the commodity theory mechanism. So a large percentage of items will not as a result be wasted. I mean, we saw recently there are news emanating about people not getting their fourth or fifth doses, vaccines are getting wasted, even the mRNA vaccines one. The commodity theory, if not prevalent, should we have capabilities in the global south in health innovation ecosystems, should then get muted if that's the channel through which why we are behaving irrationally is getting manifested. The last theory that behavioral economics offers here is the idea of prospect theories. Prospect theory basically tells that people associate greater psychological discomfort with losses than with gains due to loss aversion propensity. So suppose you have 100 rands with you and you are given 5 rands and you are taken away 5 rands. There are two worlds you are operating in. Once you are given the 5 rand, you will not be as excited as the morbidity you'll face when you're taken away the 5 rands from, right? So that's what people are repeatedly testing, showing that people associate a larger weight to the same amount of loss from a certain base, and it happens across populations, context, etc. So what that does is, in a vaccines context, countries, developed north, global north, is that the rain? Okay. The developed countries are essentially saying that we will carry just in case we need vaccines tomorrow and new variants come in. So it's closely related to the idea of hoarding and wasting vaccines tomorrow as a process. But these are the channels through which potentially behavioral explanations can be used to explain vaccine nationalism. Okay. This is all exacerbated also in a world where we know that health supply chains today as we stand is very global. I mean, I was talking to Professor Sibanda and Dr. M. Somi this morning, and I learned that 30 years back, South Africa had capabilities in vaccines in the public sector unit manufacturing, but they let go of that, and suddenly during the pandemic era, this public sector manufacturing capabilities and its needs started showing the gap that exists, right? So and why did they disappear? Because by then we had realized that you can get the vaccines that South Africa needs from, let's say, a manufacturing facility in India. Or as we saw in the Astra facility, the R&D happened in Oxford with Astra, but Serum Institute from India was manufacturing it and scaling the manufacturing, etc. Essentially, the point is, it's not just about the manufacturing bit or the fact that there's an ecosystem of generic not just vaccine, but health manufacturers in certain locations of the world. But it's so globalized all around that today there are higher exposures of this. Should there be another pandemic, should there be again vaccine nationalism, and you suddenly might land into as a country where you can't do your vaccines, your med devices, your biopharmaceuticals, and you have to scramble to correct what happened and we didn't learn from a COVID kind of a crisis. So that's the idea, and what I have is a map which shows how the same drug that you're taking or the vaccine that you're taking are like traveling all around the world in the global value chain of healthcare product supply. So what do we do about it, right? If this is what vaccine nationalism is, there is an economics of hoarding aspect to it, there are behavioral antecedents to it, there's a global health supply chain story to be told about it, and yet we are doing nothing much about it because it happened in H1N1, it happened again in COVID-19. What do we do about it? Well, to think about what we do about it, we have to go back to some basic economics, like economics in our primary school, all right? So what do we know from basic economics? We know that there is a demand curve which slopes down, which is basically telling you the story of as you consume more, the prices fall of a product, and in this case, vaccine. And this is on the demand side of the story. And on the supply side, manufacturers and sellers are willing to sell more and more as prices go up. So you have the upward sloping supply curve. And they in equilibrium, in a state where everybody is happy, both the suppliers as well as the consumers, should be meeting at that point which tells you that the equilibrium price is P and the equilibrium quantity is Q star. But if people are holding back supplies, it means there is excess demand in the market. So we come to a point of P dash, the point below P star, where there is not enough supply, although actually supply exists, it's being hoarded. It's illegal inventory in some sense. That's not meeting the excess demand that's there in the market, right? So if that's true, then as a policymaker, I see the excess demand story and start thinking, what can I do to stop this excess demand not remaining in the system? How? Essentially, its answer is try to tinker with Q. The ability to take Q towards the Q star equilibrium amount. And how do countries like South Africa or global South countries do it? Well, you have to create your local manufacturing and innovation ecosystem such that you are not beholden to outsiders, multinationals, etc. So how do you do that? Well, you have to have public policy mechanisms that one creates the upstream science and innovation capabilities, the incentives and the science ecosystem that needs to be there in universities and in SEZs and in industry university conversations. You have to have innovation policy such that startups and SMEs and entrepreneurs are incentivized to come into doing more vaccines in this context, but there's a broader story to be told here about it. And then once they have done all of this, it has to be also have the capabilities, the complementary assets, the manufacturing, the selling expertise that's needed to sell these products that are being done by entry of new manufacturers and startups, such that the Q problem in this particular picture, manifesting because of excess demand, is resolved. And then you also have to make sure as a policymaker that it's affordable to a large populace. So in that context, you have to think about the prices of these products. And I know that the national health insurance system is now coming in South Africa in a health context. So you have to think about what's the right responsible pricing such that you can, as a policymaker, allow for not just the Q to increase, but the Q to increase in a equitable way, right? So those are the conversations that you have to play with to prevent vaccine nationalism getting repeated again should another pandemic strike tomorrow. So identify its existence and at what margins you can have it, the shortage in supply and demand with new data and health economics and analytics. And the fascinating thing here is that a lot of global South countries don't have the mechanism set up to collect the data that they are generating, to the capabilities to solve that data with proper causal health economic analysis, and 3, even if they do that, they are always struggling with a clique of global north journals who are pushing you back constantly, trying to justify evidence coming from the global south, etc. So there's a bigger colonization narrative you can bring into this conversation around how data is not in place, and 2, it has to be in place to make evidence-based policy more structural and more sustainable going forward. we then have to think about, okay, suppose we know that certain provinces and certain types of households or certain demographics are overcrowded with vaccines and other demographics are getting less of vaccines. We can, as a policymaker, start thinking of redistributing, right? But data needs to allow you to do that. And this data cannot happen if it's sitting in some random government department in a hard copy format. We have to find a way to get this in a national digital health stack of the kinds, let's say, certain global south economies are trying to do now. And it cannot need to happen from data providers who are private data providers, who are potentially also captured by multinational firms and trying to lobby a certain viewpoint in policymaking as well. So it has to be primary, authentic data with appropriate causal health economic analysis, like I'll show you with my example of the paper, that will help inform who is getting more, who is getting less, how can you redistribute, and that can help you prevent sustainably vaccine nationalism and in broader sense healthcare nationalism dawning on humanity and especially in the global south going forward. I talked already about how to tinker with the queue to solve the problem of excess demand, so I'll leave it at that. But there's a broader story there about the way I was describing it, how to set up the national health innovation ecosystem, right? So in conversations today, all day today, Professor Sibanda, I had colleagues from other schools of medicine, my other colleagues here, and Dr. M. So we were talking about how do we create a national health innovation system from South Africa for the global south world, in conjunction with Nelson Mandela University, with conjunction with top Indian universities, or from like-minded colleagues in China or in South Korea or in the US. Now there is another aspect which is less emphasized in the talk today, though when I pick up my paper, I'll talk a little bit about the politics of it. Innovation today is at a very interesting, I would say, inflection point. Never, perhaps, in the history of the last 50 odd years of innovation have we seen such complexities of geopolitics impacting innovation and as a result techno-national conversations. We are seeing this in the way the US and China are fighting with each other as to who will have chip-related capability supremacy. We are seeing it in the way the US and China are fighting about whether it will be the Tesla car that will be the dominant logic in electric vehicles or whether it would be the Chinese electric vehicle cars, right? We are seeing it now in the way vaccines, biologics, biosimilars, normal pharmaceuticals, med devices, global south is fighting with the global north in what should be the normal here. So there are some interesting political aspects to this that we cannot ignore as we try to play with the Q instrument and prevent vaccine nationalism to happen. Coming to the India story, all right? So I'm not going to talk to you about nationalism in India now. I'm going to talk to you about sub-nationalism in India, all right? And some of you might be knowing about India today. You probably are more acutely aware how is India manifesting itself as really a story of different sub-national regions. So the paper that I'm going to cite to you comes from that 2009-10 H1N1 shock, okay? And it's joint work with my colleagues in National University of Singapore and University of Minnesota. Essentially, I don't know whether you can read it, but let me give you the broad story here. What happened with that shock was I had access, primary data access, of information on vaccine sales in influenza and non-influenza vaccine markets in India, in different regions of India. Some regions were advanced, like if you're visiting a Bombay or a Bangalore, they had better roads, they had better access to clinicians, and they had also the right set of politicians who are aligned with Delhi to get quicker access to vaccines. Other regions were backward in broader infrastructure terms. They were backwards in terms of prior healthcare endowments. And they were also sometimes laggards in terms of the non-alignment of the local provincial party had with the federal provincial party. So immediately you can see that there are three explanations we can use to see who got vaccines first and what type of vaccines they got in the process. And what we saw with the shock in this paper was multinationals, anticipating these differences within India between different regions, started using not just the infrastructure or the health aspects of it, but the political differences between the federal structure and the provincial structure to influence how much sales they are going to do as a share of the overall market. And that's the story of this subnationalism that I'm trying to bring you out. So if you consider India is like a European Union, an agglomeration of several provinces and states, each state can well weigh out some states in the European Union, for example. What we found in India is, in some way, evidence of what we might be able to find if there was the right set of data on vaccine nationalism globally. The tweet that Madhu Pai said, where this is like a one-time snapshot of why is the global north getting all the vaccines and not the global south? Can you explain that phenomena using the economics, the health endowments, and the political aspects of it is the argument I'm trying to give you guys. Should there be better data? But so long as that's not there, at least the Indian data is there to show you that subnationalism happens even within a country context. And here's how the picture is panning out. So here's a picture which doesn't have three regions of India, Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal, and Goa, because we didn't get access to the data around this. By the way, I need to tell you the story around the data I used for this paper, okay, and the troubles we had for that. So we moved away from the standard of pharmaceutical economics data, which is IQVIA, and I learned about a local data provider that is working with pharmacists to capture sales of medicines in India by regions. But the challenge of working with them were twofold. One, they were not covering some of the other regions like J&K, Himachal Pradesh, and Goa. And the other challenge was they were not used by prior health economists in global health economics work, so nobody in the journal space knew about them. So I had to establish that it's representative, it is good, well-curated data, and as that happened, you had to take on all kinds of questions from snarky reviewers and get the publication done. But unless you are getting the publication done, unless you are building rigorous scholarship evidence, nobody will pay attention to your story of how politics along with economics or health is influencing this differential share of multinational vaccine sales in different parts of India. People will say it's just another journalistic account of potential subnationalism existing in the system. So I want you to be aware that if we end up creating an initiative from University of KwaZulu-Natal and Sussex for Global South Health Innovation and Economics, we have to pay attention to these problems. They don't ever get documented by the professor giving a lecture or the paper getting published or the conversations we have with ministers. There are big challenges that we have to have in place and dealt with to create this data architecture such that it's also decolonized in some sense and gives you unbiased evidence. In any case, the picture here tells you that all of India saw a withdrawal of multinational influenza vaccines once the pandemic struck. The light shaded parts are the ones which saw lesser withdrawal. The dark shaded parts are the ones which saw deeper withdrawal. Now think about multinationals. Multinationals are like Sanofi's and the GlaxoSmithKline's of the world, who are smelling around the market saying, I can actually stay in Mumbai because it's rich. There are enough doctors and local primary health clinicians who can administer the vaccine. And also because the government in power at that time is aligned with Delhi, so there's a political alignment. Nobody will say that I did not serve a like-minded government and their voting constituencies, right? So as a result, you see that in regions around Mumbai and certain other parts of India, which are a check on all those three aspects, lesser multinational withdrawal. But in my home state, for example, in West Bengal, the city of Kolkata, it has a government not aligned with Delhi. Its infrastructure is crumbling for some time now, and the health endowments are not at the level of the national averages or even at the level of the national best case situations. And there you see a dark brown, right? So there is a deeper withdrawal of multinational vaccine sales post the pandemic, which shouldn't have been happening in a normative sense. It was immoral for them to do this, okay? So that's the qualitative story that we pick up with the data. And to do that picking up, we estimate two types of models. And I put those equations up. I don't want to make it too technical, but it's important to appreciate that as economists, we also care about causal assertions. So we estimate a national model of how quantity of multinational sales of vaccines are happening as a share of domestic sales, but as a function of all these 3 points that I made: economics, prior health endowments, and the politics of it. And it's done first at the national level, and then I split it up by 2 types of regions in the country: those which are politically aligned and those which are not politically aligned, those which are economically advanced, those which are not, and those which are prior health well endowed and those which are not, right? And then I estimate these models, the national model and the subnational model on the right, equation 2, and start showing this in my paper. And then there is a bunch of robustness checks you have to engage with to convince the reviewer at a top journal, this came out in Management Science, that this is indeed the robust causal picture of the story coming from data, even if you don't want to trust this data because it's coming from the global south, right? So you can see that the coefficient estimate on post-start treated. What is the coefficient estimate? It's basically telling you that after the pandemic has happened, for regions in India which are either economically advanced or backward, health endowed or not endowed, politically aligned or not endowed, aligned, how is the behavior of multinational share sales as a function of this post-start treated story? And if it's negative, it tells you that multinationals are withdrawing very rapidly. And you see that across India, it's true that multinationals are withdrawing, but it's also withdrawing not just from an economics lens to it or a health infrastructural lens to it, but look at model 7 and 8. Politics plays a very important role. This is a finding, incidentally, when I took to, Dr. Msomi was telling me that could have happened here in South Africa as well. When I take this finding to South Korea, even there I see these conversations. When I take these findings to China, I get conversations around this. So this is a finding that is going back to the point that I was trying to make about the policymaker's instrument is Q and the economics of voting and the complex politics around it, the politics of innovation nationalism globally today. And that's something we want to keep in mind from this subnational evidence coming from India. So broadly, supply side matters, so does demand side, but most importantly, it seems politics. My humble ambition, therefore, today is that I want all of us to think about the fact that vaccine nationalism has not gone away. We can't sleep. I mean, there are several other things we are fighting, the wars, bad behavior, crazy politicians around the world, etc. But this is something that's not going to go away. Once another pandemic strikes, we need to pay attention how to solve this right now. The time is now. I'm sorry to be a little doomsmongerer in saying this, but it is true. It's going to come back. And we need to pay careful evidence-based assertion to this. We need evidence-based policy making in this world. We don't need policy-based evidence. We don't need populist leaders telling us, behave in a following way because I'm telling you that. Where's the science and the data behind it? How do I trust your data and science? Is it captured? We have to have evidence-based policy making in these conversations. There has to be a coalition of innovation-minded, science-minded ecosystem stakeholders, all of us who are doing this talk today, from the global south to increase Q and the normative way to do it. It's not just a matter of being able to do a Serum Institute. It's also a matter of having a startup here in University of KwaZulu-Natal, which has, like, let's say, a platform, an mRNA platform that gets support from an Aspen locally, which ultimately gets scaled not just for South Africa or Africa, but for the entirety of global north. So we have to have that innovation coalition in the global south to make that happen, to prevent vaccine nationalism. And we also know that climate change is not going away. You guys know that, and I know that from England. I know what's happening in South Asia. Durban has had the last few weeks of unusual rains. Climate change is staring at us amazingly. And this means that as we try to do net zero societies worldwide, zoonotic diseases will keep coming back, and the propensity to start doing again vaccine and healthcare nationalism will again increase unless we come together and get our act right now in a proper way, such that we have our own self-sufficiency in creating global health innovation for the global south. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that we need to think about this in a one world, one health, one innovation way. No better way to start this than in an university environment. I'm not sure if any other place can start this but universities. And I'm glad that University of Sussex, my Vice Chancellor, my Dean at the Business School, the Science Policy Research Unit has a rich history of being one of the world's pioneering innovation studies center. They're all coming together with our shared respect for South Africa, and with University of KwaZulu-Natal and Nelson Mandela University, that something hopefully should come out of this conversation. Of all the forms of inequality, I think what Dr. Martin Luther King said, this is something that stared at me when I was, as you probably would have noticed, I moved from India to UK in the second wave of the pandemic. I saw what was happening in India, even in a world where it had a Serum Institute, but people were getting killed randomly because policymakers were not doing the right job in the way they were provisioning vaccines and healthcare. 70 million migrants suddenly, with a random lockdown, had to walk on their feet from the big cities of India to their villages with no state support. And now Bollywood movies are made around it, but we have forgotten about it. many people were suddenly told that, okay, go to this app on the phone and you will get your vaccine appointments. But the people who didn't have a phone or a stable internet or a technology to know how to actually do these appointments never got their vaccines. And I personally had to use my students to write up a code to hack that app such that I get my appointment in a big city in India. So this is how this is all panning out. We tend to think that the CoWIN app is an amazing intervention. We have Serum Institute, but even within India, there were some amazing dimensions. Science itself has reported how in the second wave, the lack of simple oxygen concentrators killed so many millions, and the government underestimated and reported those numbers in a not so right way. So the point that I'm trying to say is that I'm coming from that environment where I took pride as India as the pharmacy of the world, but I also saw real-time injustice happening to health for all. And it is the most shocking and the most inhuman of such experiences. I was in the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, as a chaired professor in health economics. When in front of me, I saw my librarian die in the campus, a young kid die in campus, and my center's manager had such a bad situation of COVID that I had to scramble with my networks to get him some remdesivir from the black market. And ultimately his eyes went bad, he's still trying to come back, etc., etc. This is not acceptable. We need to create a new normal that is going to take lessons out of this, such that nobody suffers from the global south because of the whims and fancies of profiteers, broadly speaking. So with that, I'll leave it here and I'll take your questions. I hope people online can also ask if they're on Zoom or something.
Thank you for that insightful lecture, Prof. I have one question. It's a preamble to a flood of them. I'll quote your verbatim. I'll quote your verbatim. You indicated that when you started your study, you had to generate the data almost from the ground up because you could not use the IQVIA type data or from any of those market intelligence outfits. That's the one comment you made. The second comment that you made related to your findings or any findings from a research, presumably empirical evidence from a global south source being not trusted. I'm going to be provocative here and say that we do know that a lot of policies, whether you're in the global north or global south, geopolitically or geographically, they tend to be evidence-driven. What implications does that have for the way that we prepare ourselves from a policy perspective? Because policy also determines the resources. So as we are all scrambling for pandemic preparedness, what data should we be trusting? And how do we arrive at the data that is trustworthy enough to inform policies that will be effective in the case of the next pandemic, which will surely happen in our lifetime at least?
You know, this is not an easy way to, there is no easy one way to solve this. I'll give you my India experience. So at one end, you have these multinational platforms from IQVIA, which is claiming they are picking up pharmaceuticals and med devices sales from India, also South Africa, and 27 other countries in the world. But we also know that there could be selection biases in their data. And you therefore want more careful samples of how healthcare products are getting consumed. And the way I ran into this was my friends in the industry were telling me, local industry in India were telling me, there is this Indian guy in Mumbai who is actually collecting his data with his startup. He probably also has information on how pharmacists are selling all these units. He has enough numbers on his platform to claim representativeness. Why don't you chat with him and see if you can use that as an alternative to IQVIA? Now, since then, India has had other startups collecting health data, small little units, trying to sell it to academics, etc. Now, the incentives for him to give me the data at a discounted price, once I knew about him, was that he needed academic legitimacy, right? He wants to showcase in the big world of healthcare data competition that my database has been used by a professor from IIM, published in the top journal in management and economics, and it's credible enough to sell it to other consumers, B2B industrial consumers of this product. And since I published my papers with this, I noticed that government in India started also subscribing to his data sources, not just IQVIA sources. So my broad point is that you have to have some entrepreneurial endeavors here. But I still didn't get yet, in my last 12 years of working with health and pharma in India, I still don't have access to public procurement of medical products, vaccines, manufacturers. I remember distinctly when I was finishing my PhD in 2010 and I was in the job market in the US, Ivan Ping from National University of Singapore, you should look up his work, Professor Ivan Ping, quizzed me in my interview that you are telling all your stories with private data. What about government channels through which data is flowing through? Why don't you file a Right to Information Act, or a FOIA as they call it in US, to see if government will give you that data? And I tried for 12 years to get government to give that data, or ask your friends in Delhi to see if you can put in a word for this hapless professor trying to get stuff published somewhere sitting in Bangalore. Just hasn't happened. Lesson for that from global south countries, I think you have to sensitize our policymakers that there is value. The main problem is that if the skeletons come out of the government cupboard, politicians of the day start thinking that I might lose votes, especially in a health context. But if you can show to them that even government data has value in fine-tuning the margins at which you will roll out your product access in a healthcare equitable world, or deciding, like you were telling me, how Gilead will price its products in the market to ascertain the elasticities with government side of the data, one hopes that government data will also be at least randomly sampled and be made available. A related example. So I don't know what the situation in South Africa, but I found it not so easy to get access to medical insurance claims in UK, much more easier in the US. And in the Indian context, I was sitting just my second employer there, Indian School of Business in Hyderabad, was sitting just bang opposite the building where all these medical insurance claims data was getting accumulated by the National Health Insurance Regulator. And I wanted to know what COVID-19 did to household premiums with appropriate legal, like bells and whistles, proper formal requests attached to it. Didn't get access to it. I even gave a suggestion that I don't want all access, make it all anonymous, give me some random sample to at least make some assertions about what's happening, about how households are differentially changing their premiums in the COVID days. Didn't get access to it. But this is a journey I think many global south countries will have to take. I have heard such refrains from Pakistan to Indonesia, and now I'm hearing it in South Africa, seen it in India. But this consciousness that we have to have, that data and scholarship and rigorous evidence should guide our health policy going forward, health and innovation policy, is important to have. And the last point I want to make is to be creative. So if you can't get private startups selling the data, if you can't get government to sell your data, you can always do some other things, which is around experiments, not secondary data, but you can send like mystery shoppers in the context of healthcare, right? So suppose you want to test for whether there is gender differences in access to vaccines, and you will never know it perhaps because the data doesn't exist privately, or different gender cohorts of potential buyers of vaccines, and send them out in the market and see how pharmacists are giving them to you. And some other controversial situations can also be experimented upon. So today we have the arsenal from RCTs and the work of Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and behavioral economics to send out mystery shoppers in a health context, even if not in a revealed sense, but at least in a stated sense, to understand how people are making choices, where are the distortions and the margins at which these choices are manifesting problematically, and how should policymakers should be responding to it. So, summarizing, the way to change this has taken me at least 12 years to at least establish the norm for the private data providers, more or less a failure in getting the public data, and I have done a couple of experiments to do the stated preference around health choices that people are making. But those are the pathways to explore for the Global South, I think, to solve the distortions that exist in the data consciousness in health. Nobody's getting provoked. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, Paul. I guess my question is more generic than technical. It's an interesting take. I just wondered your thought on the idea. How much of this vaccine nationalism would you say is driven by, well, let me just say, would you say, is it more politically driven in terms of public good, public health, or corporate greed, as we saw, especially in the Western countries? So I guess it's either a public matter, or do we strive for profit? Because if you saw in the US, I would say the pharmaceutical companies became a de facto government during that time. And the last one is, I think I saw that you were proposing the idea that perhaps we should, well, I would say the developing world should perhaps start thinking about developing their own supply chains and maybe even innovations, yes. But we did see some sort of that, but you also saw a lack of confidence in those innovations from the so-called developing world.
Beautiful point.
Yeah, so you can try to do that, but there's always going to be resistance to the so-called, I would say, superpowers. And when you've got organizations like the WTO who heavily rely on those so-called big economies, would you think that they will take our side than their side as well? I mean, we saw what Trump did with the WTO funding. So even if we were to try and do that, rely on our own, how much of it would be a success? I guess
great question. So on the question of what is the impact of politics versus economics and health, I just want to draw your attention to the size of the coefficient estimate. If you look at the economic factor driving how multinationals were pulling back, it's about 0.4, between 0.35 to 0.4, and you can convert it into what it means in actual terms. But politics is not far away. I mean, the fact that if you are not aligned, there's a deeper fall in multinational availability is minus 0.43. It's almost at the same levels as economics. So, I mean, this is a very specific situation. There are conversations to be had about the external validity about these results. But I mean, from our H1N1 example, from the history of hoarding in general in society, I think politics is as much an important story as the economic endowments aspect of it or the prior health endowments aspect of it. On the question of confidence, amazing question. And only answer I can give is confidence can be, it is not easy to build confidence, right? So, how do I say this? There will be a lot of failures, okay? Look at the space program in India. Before the Chandrayaan 3 thing, there was a Chandrayaan 2 thing that failed. And there were a lot of scares that even the latest moon landing thing will also fail. But they stuck to it because it's a national priority across the politics of the land, whichever denominations it might be, because they feel value from it. And this is the history of innovation, where confidence building measures, whether it's in railroads or in the way, let's say, you have a bioeconomy created in the US, you have to stick through the failures, is one point I want to make. The second point is the word coalition. When you have coalitions, the lack of confidence in one party of the coalition could be potentially complemented by the other party of the coalition. So if you have a Global South coalition where University of KwaZulu-Natal is working with Sussex and a Stanford and a Indian top institute and a South Korean university and a Chinese university, whoever is falling in something else could potentially be complemented in creating this new center kind of a thing on Global South health innovation. So coalition is one way to solve the issue of confidence apart from celebrating failure or sticking through failure. And the last point I want to make is, it's my personal life. So I mean, I didn't know that this was such a risky approach to use this Indian new private provider data will be accepted by the global North journals, right? And the way I stuck with it is, look, I have some methods training. I'm going to stick with whatever is required in terms of the econometrics. And you have to get a lot of brickbats professionally as well as personally. People are like, your wife is telling you, why are you doing these journals ultimately? Because the incentives are not aligned and da. But you have to stick with it to gain that amount of respect. And ultimately it does come when you get these things out with the fights and despite the brickbats. And then let's say Sussex tells you, we appreciate your research, we'll pick you up from India in the middle of pandemic when there were hiring freezes globally in the labor market. And you feel like the fight was well worth it. So my small answer to confidence is we should as a Global South coalition of countries learn to celebrate and stick through failures, be even more stronger together in a coalition world. And last would be the idea of there would be sacrifices you'll have to make in the short run for the long run. We know from the lives of Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, the sacrifices they made to build the confidence of their nations. Similar stories here as well, right? So.
Prof, one of the last two questions. You spoke about data, the importance of data and I guess market intelligence. I'm just trying to figure out in building the health innovation framework in the Global South, how we go about creating that, because I know one of the challenges often cited by innovators is the lack of funding or financing. And I'm trying to make the connection, it's a tenuous connection between being able to predict the market. I'm doing an innovation that will address this market need, but there is no data, particularly for non-consumption markets. Because I suspect that might be the challenge here, that non-consumption markets are fairly difficult, first of all, to generate data from a needs perspective, but secondly, to generate data that is strong enough to convince an investor. Whether that investor is a public investor, government, or that investor is private capital. How do we bridge that gap?
So when people tell me that there is no data, I refuse to believe there is no data. There must be data. It's a question of whether you have access to that data. And in that you have to be a relentless sleuth, an investigator. Right? So I'll give you the example of LV Prasad Eye Institute, South Asia's largest eye care hospital system in Hyderabad, whom I work with. That particular unit is funded by Wellcome Trust in my work for, I think, at least from 2015 to 2017, the doctors in that unit, and it's one of the WHO approved largest eye care providing unit in that region, they said, okay, we'll do our provisioning of healthcare, we'll do our provisioning of affordable healthcare, but we'll also make sure we get our data in order. Because every day, 50,000 patients are walking through my hospitals, not just in Hyderabad, but in the rural areas of that province. And I'm not doing enough in terms of creating a data system around it. So there's a doctor I know, my colleague and collaborator in this, who he's given the mandate to be the chief technology officer of that initiative. He creates iSmart, on which now there is a Harvard case study, which is basically an electronic medical record system in LV Prasad, a small little sample of the entire way India treats its eye care. But at least we have iSmart, whose data we can now use after this doctor's work, and thankfully institutionally supported, to inform in conversations around how do you think about pricing diabetic retinopathy in the National Health Insurance Program? How do you thinking about pricing biologics in treatment of eye diseases? Because you have this small little sliver of data in LV Prasad system, which you can use to publish, and nobody can say that's bad data because it's solid primary data. We worked hard to create it. That's basically the way they did it. Narayana Rudalaya or Arvind Eye Hospital, which are the other comparator hospital systems in India, don't have such a robust eye electronic medical record system. The message, therefore, Dr. M. Somi, is that I refuse to believe there is no data. We have to keep pushing our appetite and call to arms for having data access for larger social welfare. And in that, we have to adopt a very creative investigatorial approach and have to be relentless and find some little small subsamples to work with, do your experiments, see if you can get a comparator country. If you can't get South Africa, maybe you can get a province in the border that is shared with Zimbabwe and South Africa of similar demographics. And maybe Zimbabwe is doing a better job of capturing that data. And use that to say something about what might be happening on the South Africa side, etc., etc. So there are very creative econometric approaches you can adopt to do stuff and create the consciousness around evidence and data, I think. And don't accept when people tell you there is no data. That's basically my point to students. There is data. Question is, do you have access to that data or not? You had another question. You said two questions.
I was going to give Prof. Sibanda a chance, but I will ask it now because it goes back to market intelligence, what people would call market analysis. Currently, there is a strong push globally as a result of vaccine nationalism and the pandemic for manufacturing in the global south. If you look at the map now, there's any number of global players, venture philanthropists, and those types who are advocating for manufacturing capabilities in Africa. And it was mentioned in my last question because it's very provocative. And you've shown in one of your slides, trying to get it's easy to fund manufacturing because manufacturing is the end game and there's no risk, presumably. But it's not easy to fund innovation. And part of this is what we're talking about, trying to ascertain the demand. And I guess my question is, if you had to make the choice as somebody from the global south in trying to build this capability in the global south, what is the prudent or the wise choice? Should we be pushing for innovation, knowing what you spoke about earlier on global supply chains, or should it be manufacturing? I just want some clarification on that because...
I will... Go ahead.
No, continue.
Business and economic history shows that maybe the more rational, wise choice is to display some ambidexterity. So be realistic about your local circumstances and perhaps start off with manufacturing, but keep the aspirations for more radical, innovative upstream work going in the background, maybe in university labs, etc. Classic example of this ambidexterity displaying is a non-health context. So Samsung became the world's largest player in smartphones beyond Apple, essentially displaying ambidexterity from South Korea. In the initial days, it was not doing too much of innovative work. And later on, as it started doing its exploration or taking on Apple's patents, by then it had already stabilized itself as a manufacturing powerhouse in the smartphone space globally. Look at what Huawei is doing with Kirin chips and the world with 5G. Same aspirations. Let's make ourselves robust in manufacturing. Soon enough, our background work in innovations will try to see if we can leapfrog in more radical discovery work. my suspicion is, with all the experiences of the vaccine story, a Serum Institute or a CIPLA or a Reddy's and a Biocon, these are the four big innovation and science-oriented Indian biopharmaceutical manufacturer. They didn't do much innovation work in the vaccine era, but they are taking on some of the explorative work in R&D, the discovery science themselves, which we are not probably aware of now ourselves in a public space, but they're doing it and they're waiting for the right opportunity to launch it. Or a startup like Genova for mRNA platforms, right? You kept talking about insulin's high priceness despite patent expiring. Biocon in Bangalore is a very well-known biologics and biosimilars manufacturer, but now it's taking on Wegovy, the anti-diabetes drug that is around the world. And Novo Nordisk is not at all happy with it. But the point is that even Apple was not happy with Samsung, but Samsung didn't stop itself from doing the exploration work till it got the confidence from the manufacturing work, and then became one of the top two duopoly players in this space. So to summarize, I think the way forward is it's not either or. You have to be smart in the way you start establishing your capabilities in manufacturing, but also dynamic in the way you also start spreading your wings to be aspirational and discovery oriented. And there are ample instances from the business and economic history world where some success stories are there to borrow from. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that insightful lecture. I learned a lot. I hope many in this room are inspired and would want to join health economics. I'm looking forward to seeing more health economists coming out of academics in this space. Colleagues, Dr. Msomi, who is the Director of Research and Innovation, is going to give us closing remarks and also acknowledge Professor Chatterjee. Doc, you have the floor. This side, please. Colleagues, after this session, Prof will be around to interact with some of you or some of us who want to build relations and networks. The floor is yours, Doc. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Sibanda. And on behalf of Prof. Sibanda, I'd like to thank Prof. Chatterjee for an insightful presentation. It's certainly been a very, very exciting day for us at the university, particularly in the innovation discipline. We've been talking about this for some months, and I think I speak for other colleagues when I say we look forward to this very fruitful engagement in building what may turn out to be a groundbreaking initiative, looking at the economics of health innovation in the global south. As you correctly said earlier on, it's one thing to be always moaning and protesting about how the global north continues to dominate and to exert this influence over us when we have the weapons. We may not be, as individuals, as UKZN, be strong enough to face that onslaught. But if we build a coalition of progressives globally, we probably are likely to prevail. And it's a big ask to begin this type of scholarship. You spoke about having to find a small company or outfit to provide this information. I think in South Africa, we are in a fortunate position because we have a constitution that guarantees the promotion of access to Information Act, through that PIA Act. So that information is available as a starting point. However, it's not processed or refined enough. It needs to be done in a manner that provides intelligence for policy direction and for ensuring that the policies respond to the needs on the ground. The second issue is that this lecture and this proposed collaboration with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, between the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Sussex, and the Nelson Mandela University, and a whole host of other universities locally and internationally, comes at a very opportune moment for the country when we are moving towards the national health insurance, which in the correct framework is going to guarantee universal access to quality healthcare for South Africans. And my sense, I guess my biased sense, is that one of the most important ingredients of that NHI is going to be around innovation. And this scholarship of innovation, which currently does not exist, is going to go a long way in making sure that this dream becomes a reality. And lastly, I think in thanking you, is in our engagement has been that discussion around the role of universities and institutions of higher learning and public research institutions in shaping the future that we want, and that we want for ourselves, we want for our children, and we want for our society. And I'm hoping that the scholarship of innovation that we're speaking about will begin to make that a possibility, not only a possibility, beyond that, it becomes something that becomes practical. So that when we learn about innovation, we do not adopt innovation frameworks willy-nilly from the north. We build our own innovation frameworks. So it's not just the ambition of providing data, it's the ambition of building models of innovation that capture the latent value that we lose every day by not engaging. Thank you for the gift, Prof, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for attending. We truly appreciate your presence. Let's keep on networking. See you in some other spaces. Once again, thank you very much, Prof. Chatterjee.